Houston was supposed to be the freest city in America. No zoning code telling you what to build, no bureaucrat deciding what belongs next to what, and enough room to drive anywhere without friction. That was the promise sold to generations of residents and businesses. Build what you want, park where you want, move at the speed of the automobile. But drive through Houston today and you find a strange contradiction. The city that promised freedom of movement is now covered, block after block, in surface lots and structured garages that sit empty most of the day. Getting anywhere on foot is often unsafe or simply impossible, not because the city ran out of room, but because so much of that room was set aside for cars that never move. That's the puzzle this episode sits inside. To understand it, we have to separate what is documented from what is assumed. What is documented at the policy level is straightforward. Municipal governments across the United States have long used a specific regulatory tool called a parking mandate. A parking mandate is a policy decision, usually made by a city government, that requires new developments to provide a set number of parking spaces before they're allowed to open. That's the mechanism at the center of this story, and it's the one piece of this puzzle we can state with confidence rather than guess at. Here is the constraint that mandate creates once you sit with it. A parking requirement doesn't just add a few spots to a building, it changes what gets built in the first place. If a developer wants to open a small shop, a restaurant, or an apartment building, the mandate forces them to calculate upfront how many cars they expect, and then dedicate land to storing those cars, whether or not the demand ever materializes. That land isn't available for housing, for storefronts, for trees, for sidewalks. It's set aside, by policy, for parked metal. This is the hidden system running underneath a lot of post-war American development, and Houston is one of the clearest places to see its footprint, precisely because the city built so much, so fast, under exactly this kind of framework. The first attempts to manage Houston's growth leaned hard into the idea that mobility meant driving, and that driving meant guaranteed parking everywhere a car might want to stop. That is consistent with what parking mandate policy is designed to do everywhere it's applied. Guarantee supply regardless of actual demand. What we don't have in the material available for this episode is a documented account of the exact ordinances Houston passed, the specific years they took effect, or the specific ratios of spaces required per building type. That's a real gap, and rather than fill it with invented dates or numbers, it's worth naming directly. What we can say is that the general mechanism, requiring parking as a condition of building, is the same mechanism used broadly by municipal governments, and Houston operated within that broader pattern. There's a turning point implied by the mechanism itself, even without a precise date attached to it in Houston's case. Once a city commits to mandating parking supply ahead of demand, it locks in a feedback loop. Buildings get surrounded by parking. That parking spreads distances between destinations. Spread out destinations make walking less practical. Less practical walking increases reliance on cars. Increased car reliance strengthens the political and practical case for more parking mandates. This is not a story about one bad decision on one specific day. It's a story about a policy tool that, once adopted, tends to reinforce the very demand it was built to satisfy. Let's slow down on the mechanism itself, because this is the part that actually explains the title's question. A parking mandate works by shifting risk and cost away from the driver and onto the building. Instead of a driver paying directly for where they park, or a market deciding how much parking is actually needed, the requirement is baked into the cost of construction before anyone knows whether that many cars will show up. Developers pass that cost into rents, into retail prices, into the footprint of the property itself. The practical result, wherever this mandate is applied at scale, is more land dedicated to storing vehicles and less land available for the density that makes walking between destinations realistic. Houston did not invent this mechanism. It is one of the cities where this mechanism has had a large amount of land and a long amount of time to operate. The cost of that isn't abstract. Every acre given over to a parking requirement is an acre not used for housing units. not used for a wider sidewalk, not used for a park, not used for the kind of mixed walkable block that makes a short trip on foot pleasant rather than dangerous. Even without a precise inventory of how many acres this has consumed citywide, the visible pattern, wide surface lots buffering low-density buildings from the street, is the direct expected output of a policy built to guarantee parking supply first and design a walkable environment second, if at all. It's important to hold the uncertainty here honestly, rather than smooth it over. We do not have, in the documented material for this episode, a specific record of when Houston's requirements were adopted, how they've changed over time, or what precise ratios applied to which building types. Cities across the country have modified, reduced, or in some cases eliminated parking mandates in recent years, and it is plausible Houston has been part of that broader conversation, but this episode cannot state that as a confirmed fact without a source behind it. What can be stated is the general policy category, and what informed observers of urban development consistently point to as its structural effect: mandates decouple parking supply from actual measured demand. So where does that leave the city today? Houston remains a place where the built environment visibly reflects decades of policy favoring guaranteed car storage over walkable density. That is an observable pattern, not a moral failing of the people who live there, and not evidence that every planning decision in Houston's history has failed. One mechanism, parking mandates, produced a landscape that makes walking harder than it needs to be. That is different from saying the city itself has failed as a whole. The contradiction from the opening still stands. A city built around the promise of easy movement now spends enormous amounts of its land making a different kind of movement, walking structurally difficult. The lesson sits in the mechanism itself, not in blame. A policy that forces supply ahead of demonstrated need doesn't just add convenience, it reshapes what a city can physically become, block by block for generations, long after the original justification is forgotten. Understanding that mechanism is the first real step toward asking whether a different set of rules could produce a different kind of city. And that question, what happens when a city rewrites that rule, is where this story leads next. Visual reconstructions are illustrative. Facts and interpretations are based on the sources listed in the description.